To be truly Canadian, it helps to be your enemy first. Take, for example, the experience of German and Japanese Canadians in wartime internment camps. Prior to the First World War, Germans had immigrated to Canada in large numbers, especially in the mid to late 1800s. And they had held high with kind of an immense pride their culture and traditions, things like Sangafesta, Turnverein, Oktoberfest, and so on. And they built their own churches, their public schools, and were known as astute business leaders and industrious farmers. In fact, so large was their influence on southern Ontario that it was reported to be a necessity to speak German, particularly if one wanted to live or visit or do business in one of the region's main cities, which was Berlin. It was called Berlin at that time. So these German Canadians had put strong emphasis on the German part of their identity, often more than the Canadian part, and that would come to haunt them later. Well, immediately prior to World War I, there was a general air of fondness towards these German Canadians that kind of radiated throughout the country. In 1914, the Governor-General, the Duke of Connaught, remarked on the German Canadian qualities of industriousness and an ethic of hard work. And he said, "I'm sure that these inherited qualities will go far in the making of Canadians." Well, less than 3 months later, the Duke's terms of warm sentiment and endearment quickly vanished. Suspicions were ignited, and the first outward sign of mistrust towards these German Canadians actually happened in Berlin, Ontario. And it was when a bronze bust of Kaiser Wilhelm I in a local city park was vandalized. And the 150-pound bust was actually tossed into a lake. Fear and animosity directed at those Germans, or those German ethnicities, festered and eventually grew into a national purge of all that was German, symbols, language, culture, and so on. Well, Berlin changed its name to Kitchener. Kaiser, Saskatchewan changed its name to Pebbles. Karlstadt, Alberta became Alderson. Dusseldorf to Freedom. And German languages, or German language classes, were erased from school curricula everywhere. German newspapers were shut down. And speaking German in public, well, that was simply asking for trouble. So quite understandably during wartime, those suspected of being sympathetic towards Germany and her allies soon had to register with authorities. And they were restricted in their movements. So it didn't take long before some, and I put this in quotes, 8,500 German Canadians and Austro-Hungarians were placed in internment camps for the duration of the First World War. Roughly 3,000 were POWs. The rest were all suspicious, and all were released after the Great War. But history would repeat itself again 2 decades later when the Second World War began. Germany once again was Canada's enemy, and all German Canadians who entered after 1922, whether citizens or not, were forced to register as enemy aliens. Approximately 800 were put in internment camps. Immigration from Germany was completely banned altogether at the beginning of the war. In 1941, since most of the German internees in the Second World War internment camps turned out to be acceptably and culturally Canadian, and they showed no support for Nazism, they were eventually released. 89 questionable individuals remained for the entire duration of the war. Nevertheless, a psychological scar had been inflicted. German Canadians would go on to suppress their ethnic identity during and after both wars. Even the 250,000 German immigrants that came in the 1950s and 1960s held their identities in check. Surnames were changed to British-sounding ones. German heritage was abandoned, the language discarded. The youth married non-Germans. It was as though quick assimilation appeared to be welcome by Germans themselves. And in fact, Jeanette Catherine Paul, an identity researcher, noted in her original graduate thesis that, and I put this in quotes, German Canadian immigrants from the post-war years experienced discrimination and negativity which forced them to submerge their true identities. End of quotes. German ancestry in the post-war years was relinquished instead of celebrated in order to gain what is perhaps one of the most intense human desires of all, to be accepted. The whole experience gave way to an unhyphenated Canadian identity. Germans, it could be argued, assimilated themselves. Well, this process of assimilation, a type of endogenous acculturation, into a more locally dominant culture is not by any means a unique phenomenon. Mongolian warriors, finding themselves stranded in China after the Mongolian Empire began to collapse in the 14th century, took to marrying locals and relinquishing their Mongolian heritage to become Han Chinese. Having traveled far and wide, Vikings, too, are long gone from the cultural identity record, now assimilated and morphed into what are today ethnic Bulgarians, Russians, Danes, and so on. The historic list of endogenous acculturation, extensive and recognizable enough as it is, need not be revisited here with any more than a sort of a cursory mention. But what is particular to Canada is the unusual cause of rapid assimilation: external war. The nexus between external war and an increase in local identity certainly applies in the case of the Germans during the 20th century, but it also applies to another ethnic group as well: Japanese Canadians. After the Japanese Imperial Navy bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, mistrust, suspicion, and a hard edge of racism were heaped heavily on Japanese Canadians. Everyone of Japanese descent that lived within 100 miles of the West Coast, whether a Canadian citizen or not, was sent to internment or work camps further inland, places like New Denver, BC, Greenwood, and Salmo. The humiliation was said to be enormous. But, like those of German descent during the First World War, those of Japanese descent felt the wrath of a country that didn't trust them. And much like the German community, the Japanese community had been very proud of their heritage in the pre-World War or in the pre-war years. Proud, unfortunately, also meant insular. Marriage exclusively within the local Japanese community had the benefit of maintaining Japanese businesses, family, and community, and it built the foundation of Japantowns that were up and down the West Coast, all the way from Vancouver to Los Angeles. This insularity, however, facilitated suspicion and animosity, and it was to become a stepping stone to confinement. Japanese internees were eventually released from the camps after World War II, yet noteworthy for their absence rather than their revival, Japantowns never had a presence in the urban centers again, much in the same way Kitchener never restored its full German heritage. So we have to ask, well, why? And little in the way of research has been done on this question, but a revealing documentary, One Big Hapa Family from 2010, produced by filmmaker Jeff Chiba Stearns, set out to answer an important parallel question. Why did every generation after his own grandparents, his own Japanese grandparents' generation, marry non-Japanese spouses? His Japanese grandparents lived in Kelowna, British Columbia, during the Second World War. They were beyond the 100-mile exclusion zone and therefore not sent to internment camps. His extended family, regardless, appeared to imitate the common trend among Japanese Canadians in the post-World War II decades. They were marrying outside their own ethnic group at exceedingly high rates. In the 1970s, the marriage rate outside the Japanese community was around 50%. One generation later, it had reached 95%. In Chiba Stearns' extended family, it was 100%. The Japanese, like the Germans, were assimilating themselves. What Chiba Stearns exposed in his documentary was a pre-war Japanese-Canadian community that had been contradictory in its desires. On the one hand, they accepted marriage, only among their own. On the other hand, they wished to be accepted by the general population as equals, with the ability to vote, hold office, and not face discrimination. Animosity, discrimination, and the internment camps, however, had been the repercussions of their conflicting desires. The experience of the internment camps specifically led to a great deal of soul-searching. Some 4,000 individuals decided to leave and go back to Japan after the war, but those that remained in Canada decided to let their sons and daughters marry whom they wished. As it turned out, love was blind. More importantly, they, such as Chiba Stern's own parents, who were married in the 1970s, were now identifying themselves as unequivocally Canadian. And by 2002, according to the Ethnic Diversity Survey, the majority of Canadians of Japanese origin, some 68%, felt a strong sense of belonging to Canada. The parallel between two wars involving Germany and Japan is that the two respective ethnic groups in Canada had been labeled as enemies and forced to choose their loyalties. The experience of the internment camps thrust a pivotal choice upon each group that required a transcendent crossing of a cultural threshold. Would they hold steadfast to an identity rooted in their old cultures of origin, or relinquish it in order to accept a new one? Both, in the end, chose new over old. They chose Canadian, unhyphenated. In a great irony, discrimination facilitated assimilation. This brings up a rather strange question. Could it be that discrimination, embedded in a perverse kind of enigma, is in reality a path to unity? Canada's wartime internment camps, quite unintentionally, had the strange benefit of leading many of the internees to become more culturally Canadian. The head-turning lesson in hindsight seems rather obvious. If one wants to be truly Canadian, it helps to be your enemy first.